Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic and usually on location. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT luminaries to discuss a single concept. In this episode, we're talking about unstructured data, and frankly, you're not ready to deal with this problem. Before we begin, let's meet who's on the panel today.
Hey, y'all, I'm Gina Rosenthal. I am the founder of Digital Sunshine Solutions. I help companies with their product marketing struggles. And you can talk to me live and in person on Twitter at gminx.
Hello, I'm Enrico Signoretti. I am a senior analyst at Geekom, and you can find me on Twitter as eSignoretti.
Hi, I'm Amy Fowler. I am responsible for strategy and product marketing for the FlashBlade business unit at Pure Storage. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Amy Fowler, and also on Pure Storage. I have a lot of blogs on this subject.
And a lot of us actually have a lot of blogs on this subject because, of course, unstructured data is one of those things that, honestly, we've been talking about for a long, long time. Even before Tech Field Day, before Gestalt IT, when I was working as a storage consultant, this was one of the big topics. And, you'd think that since this has been a problem for a long time, we would have had a better handle on it. But frankly, I guess by definition, unstructured data is unstructured. And frankly, it's growing. We're seeing a lot more. And people really aren't ready to deal with it. Amy, let's start with you, since I know that you have written on this subject. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the general concept. What are we talking about when we say unstructured data?
Well, we're basically talking about the types of data that doesn't fit neatly into a database, and in general, that is machine generated instead of human generated. And so the volume of it is significantly bigger. It can range everything from IoT sensor data to medical images to drone footage. And so the variety of this data also makes it particularly challenging. And what we're seeing now is that the new opportunities that the potential for analytics presents to get more out of this ever-growing volume of unstructured data is really putting an increased demand on organizations to figure that out, to get it right. And with, again, the volume, the variety, and just the speed at which it's being generated, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, if I add to this, I mean, when you define the machine generating and human generating, now we lived in a very strange time in the last couple of years where a lot of processes changed, and honestly, also human generated data is growing now at an incredible pace. Think only at university lessons or even my kids. Every single lesson is now recorded and stored in somewhere, most of the time in the storage of the university, which is growing in a crazy way. The problem is that these people, yes, they know when it was recorded, they know who recorded the session, but actually who was there and what was the content and all this kind of stuff. That is becoming the problem. So knowing what you have, what you're dealing with, and these kind of things.
I think the whole concept of a database is also changing, right? So we've got a different way of organizing data in different types of databases so that they can be super elastic and you can actually get more information out of the data that's stored. If you use the example of a user of a video, like Enrico was talking about, what were the people doing behind the scenes? Is there chat attached to that? What was the actual instruction given? Was there a talk script to that? How does that all go together? What were the emotions behind it? What is any kind of other information you can gather from that so you can improve the instruction, or you can change the instruction, or you can outlaw the topic, as it seems to be the hot topic in the States, right? So there's all sorts of stuff that goes with just, we've got all of this data and the data about data that can be gathered now. How do we make information, and who gets to make the information out of that metadata?
Well, to your point, the augmentation factor is fundamental now. So when you ingest new data, when you manage data that is unstructured, having a mechanism to augment with metadata, with real metadata. So not just the basic metadata that comes with the file, but actually all the information that you can put on top of it could really change the thing. And I was with some of my clients lately, and we talked a lot about how would you like to reuse to use your data, and in fact having this augmentation and rationalization and then automation around all these aspects of data is now becoming fundamental. Think about for example, having everything, every metadata on your systems cataloged somehow, so like a big database. Okay, so you start thinking about your unstructured data like a massive database with, of course, unstructured data. So it's becoming more manageable, more reusable somehow.
I'm glad that you brought up the topic of big data, because that really gets me thinking about sort of the true nature of unstructured data, because I always defined big data as basically data that's too big to manage in conventional ways. Unstructured data, in a way, is defined by the fact that it is not structured. So is it possible, I mean, will we ever get out of an era of unstructured data, or do we just have to sort of dive in and have an alternative solution to the problem?
Well, I don't think that unstructured data per se is going away. I mean, by its definition, there's not going to be any shortage of file and object data getting created. And I think the IDC projections are that by 2025, 80% of enterprise data is unstructured, which I think is notable, because it's easy to think about just the social media and the things that we all create, videos. I'm sure how many terabytes that my personal family has created over the past few years. And for this to be translating into enterprise data, and candidly for enterprises to need to think about even the types of data I just mentioned. And I think, Gina, you hit on this a little bit, which is how are you going to triangulate the consumer sentiment in all of the places that lives with my shopping behavior, and bring that all together to make more make more intelligent spend in terms of advertising, in order to present me with the right thing so that I'm more likely to buy it at the right time. And the diversity in all of this that I think 10 years ago just wasn't present in the enterprise. It wasn't a consideration. There's just been a sea change really in terms of the ways and opportunities for organizations to use it. So I don't think having it go away or shrink is really an option. I think it becomes so much more of a game of how do you set yourself up to get the most out of it? And that's a question that needs to be answered at many, many, many different layers in the stack and in the data center.
Yeah, I think to that point, I don't think it was affordable to capture all of the unstructured data into a database to make sense of it and abstract information from it. I think it was you think of the way a database works, you collect the data, but you're telling the data the information you want to glean from it. And you're not necessarily allowing the information making happen on its own, because I can remember not being able to keep log files because we just couldn't afford the storage. This is 10, 12 years ago to keep them on. So we had to prune the log files, and we had to make sure they were backed up to tapes if we ever needed to go back to them. But we couldn't keep all the log files we wanted because we couldn't afford to do it. And it was really, that's back in the days where file systems were less than a terabyte. You couldn't get over a terabyte in a file system. So we definitely weren't keeping all the data that we could have gotten then, but we just couldn't do it. I think it's really interesting. There's a paper from SAGE, which is all about information studies, that kind of thing. But they say the data doesn't speak for themselves, but data has to be narrated, and that's what the databases do. So if we're able to get the data and we're able to store it, then we are able to tell what your shopping experience is and what we should flash at you while you're in a store or send to your email and your social and every place else that you might have eyeballs on it, but we're telling the story of the data. When you think of something like making sales better or making consumer experience better, that's great. But then we have this enormous opportunity and responsibility to make sure we think about society as a whole. Who gets to tell the stories from the data that's there? Because that's always happened too. This metadata has always been there. We built databases to get story information from it. Now what's going to happen with all this big data? It's endless what we can do to tell the story.
Well, consider that, I mean, you're right. I mean, we are past the moment when, a couple of decades ago, 10 years ago, when everything was tough, when it was about capacity. Also because capacity was also only developed with object stores that were huge, but at the same time almost inaccessible. I mean, no standard APIs, no application using object storage. I mean, our object storage was that for several years. Now everything changing, and we have file systems that are huge. I mean, billion of files. Millions of directories and files of every size, and also object stores are more accessible because every application in the world uses object storage now. Well, every application not, but actually a large number of applications is using object storage. So the question is, so capacity is no longer a problem, and not even performance. I mean, we have all-flash scale-out systems today. They are affordable enough for you to run, the analytics like you were, a national laboratory, but you're just a medium-sized enterprise. So you can do everything you want. The problem is, how do you manage all this data to make sense of it? Because today you can collect thousands, millions of sensors every day, and then what is good, what is not, what is, what do you have to store forever? What do you need just for a couple of days? This is the problem today. So you need to find ways, you need to find tools to understand your data, reuse your data when possible, because reusability of the data is another key point today. And of course, look at the long term. Even if, again, we have these massive file systems that are available, and you can't keep storing everything without thinking about maybe having multiple tiers, having a cloud like AWS Glacier or S3 never accessed again kind of tier or whatever you want, so that you can save on some dollar per gigabyte. So you need all these tools to normalize, rationalize all your data sets, and then having something to understand when, what, and how to do. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there is all the security aspects that come with it. Because if they can, encrypt all your traditional storage, think about when they are able to encrypt all the files that you have in this massive scale-out file system. So you need, an infrastructure that can understand ransomware, can understand other type of security threats that are, around now. So that are the real challenges today, no longer scalability or performance for me.
So Enrico, you just said so many things that I largely agree with, but I'd love to unpack just a little bit more, which is, I think you hit on something there that when, old school object storage, for example, was almost so slow that it was not usable in the way that we're talking about using data. And it's really only been I'd say the past few years that we've seen that shift to where actually having all flash, having performance object storage has become a mainstream thing. And the other couple key elements here are that if there's not some degree of performance, you simply cannot get insight. So this ability to scale with performance becomes, on the infrastructure side, super, super critical. And I think we can break it up into, there is then, okay, what does it take to do that seamlessly and cost effectively? And then you have this whole other layer of, but what else, what are the other tools and systems you're using to actually get insights into that data now that you have put it onto a scale out infrastructure that is simple and seamlessly scalable, and cost effective. And just to piggyback a little bit more on the point that we're seeing this transition, which is, we're only a few years away from the price per gig crossover point between SSDs and HDDs. And really, we saw a tipping point, let's call it 7-8 years ago, with block storage when we saw that crossover point with 15K drives. And now that we're seeing it approach, it just really opens up this world of possibilities in terms of scaling out and getting the insights that you want. And I would argue that we're heading towards a world from that perspective of basically, you have either data that you need to be able to, aggregate and annotate and get insights out of. And then you have super, like you mentioned, Glacier, then you have super cold data. There's none of this in the middle, I think, anymore. There's either it's valuable or it's compliance or, in case of emergency. And, in terms of solving for all of the infrastructure related, elements, that's an area I'm super passionate about. But I'd love to get, your Gina or Stephen's perspectives on like, what are those other things at that layer above, that are the complement to it, because it's certainly not something that can be, solving the unstructured data challenge is one part infrastructure and storage and several parts other things in the stack.
So that's actually something that I'd like to kind of connect with how I introduced it, because we've been dealing with unstructured data forever, but what we didn't have at the time were systems that, as Amy described, offer extreme levels of scalability, high performance, and most importantly, integration with applications. Because now we've got a situation where we can actually do something with some of this unstructured data. We can store huge volumes of it, as Gina was getting to as well. We can store volumes of it in a way that are online and accessible. And not only that, I'd like to connect it as well. As you know, I run the Utilizing AI podcast, and one of the things that we cover there is the fact that AI enables us to do more. Machine learning can process more data, which enables us to collect more data, which enables us to filter out more data than we ever could before. And so we do have new tools here, right? I mean, I think that's the point, is that this is an age-old problem, but we have new tools that will allow us to do new things, right?
Well, think of, for example, something that many enterprises use, like Splunk. Okay, so when we didn't have these kind of tools, okay, just making sense of log files was, very, very difficult. Now we have end users storing gigabytes, sometimes terabytes and terabytes of log files every day. But if you don't have the performance to access the data, if you don't have the application to understand the data, if you don't have any of the possible, interaction and with the data that is possible now with tools like this. I mean, I mentioned Splunk, but there are several other tools that can, create similar insights. So the idea here is that now we have the tools, we have the performance, and we have the application, or we have the right data management tools to make sense of this data, so that you can decide what is worth using. And again, so log files are good, and as you said, you need the mechanism to understand, okay, I need the log files immediately to see if there is a trouble coming, if there is an issue, if there is something around the corner. But actually, after a week, after 2 weeks, do you really need these log files? Maybe yes, because for compliance, as Amy said, or for other things, but actually you don't access them anymore. I mean, you already collected the important information. You have the important information in the upper stack, so dashboard and things, so what happened, trends on the logs, and the rest can be flashed on a secondary storage. So I totally agree. I mean, we need really fast storage. And then, well, I came up with this concept several years ago now, and I was calling it flash and trash. So flash as the primary layer, and everything else is trash. I mean, you put it somewhere in a junkyard and you will never use it again, but actually you have to keep it. So that's the idea. And now we have the tools to do all of this.
So I'm going to be the person that brings it back to people because that's what my passion is here, right? And I think that, it's important to remember that data is what's used to build information. And that's been since the beginning of time. And there's information we have that we have found out over the years that is totally false because some of the information was hidden. So that's what I find interesting about this, is we now have the ability to keep all this data and the ability to rehydrate it and the ability to match it in new ways. And we have all the ability to do more than the log files. We have the ability to get kind of like that outside stories, and it's personal stories, but to anything where you can build up the information from there. Like example, I was trying really hard to think of a good innocuous example, but I think like the movie Hidden Figures is a great one. We have all of these women who led the early days of computing, but we don't know those stories because that data was never brought into the story of the history of computing. And now we're finding that data and rehydrating it and talking more about it. This could be for anything you imagine, for a good way for a data set that a company or a government may have, but it could also be really bad where they don't want you to find the information about this is very dark, but maybe they don't want you to see the information what happened during a clinical trial. So they kind of downplay that data and put up the really good, happy data, and that could have devastating effects. But I think that when we're talking about data, we are to the point where I think that we'll be able to capture all of the attachments to information that we never were able to capture and store. It's just a matter of what will be captured and what the data will be, what information will be built in from that data. That will be interesting. And I think it's really important as the people that create the structures for that to happen, because no doubt it's possible now and it will happen. How do we help make sure that all the data that's collected is able to be rehydrated or reused or made into information at some point?
So I don't have the answer to that, because I think that now we're getting into ethics and and things that are kind of beyond the scope of what a data infrastructure and storage platform organization kind of can affect in a practical way. I will comment though, and I'll kind of try to maybe triangulate, Gina, from what you're talking about, just like the human element of it, and Enrico, the example you were using of logs being, something that maybe you do flash and trash, and that's a fun expression, which would be, for example, in the world of like medical imaging, right? Where you have a situation, I'll give a couple different examples here. Number one, you now have the ability to potentially go back and apply AI to, petabytes of clinical image data in order to get new insights into disease trends, right? So this is, that's an example where you might have thought, well, although we need to store these diagnostic images, these PACS images for, 7, 10, 21 years for compliance reasons, now it's not just about compliance. It's about getting more clinical insights. It also can even be, from a very real-time perspective, a matter of saying, I don't know what kind of ad hoc query is going to happen because somebody shows up in my emergency department. And if somebody comes in and they happen to have been in 3 months ago, I don't want that to be on some super slow deep archive. Like, I didn't know I was going to need it, but I have a potential to impact patient care and the overall clinical workflow if I have it. We're seeing organizations like Page AI go back and take huge volumes, and this ties to the AI question of huge volumes of digital pathology images in order to validate, basically validate diagnosis, because pathology is an expert physician looking at pictures, and think about how much value there is if you can actually have millions of those that have then also been cross-validated by genomic sequencing. Another example of where you have these sets of data that you might scan, create the full set, get the final excerpts, but then there's a new variable that's identified. You want to reuse that original terabyte worth of data to figure out what the impact is. So, I think I guess my personal belief is that overall there is more upsides to positive outcomes by making good choices of use out of the data. But when we're getting into the ethics of all of it. The only other thing I could say, Gina, is great call out on Hidden Figures, like one of the one of the best stories and movies ever. So,
right. Actually, just kind of piggybacking on that example of using the medical imaging, it has the potential to right an ethical wrong. So one of the ways doctors are trained are based on very weird racial formulas and skews that are not, medically correct. So you have this way now to take all of those images and prove and say these are really the rates at which people get sick and what you should be looking for. And I think a great example of that is probably with the NFL and I forget what it's called, the
CTE?
concussion. Yeah,
CTE.
Yeah, because I think there's actually a lawsuit about that right now. So you can imagine that some of this is being used in real time, but it's a great way it's the same story, that the stories weren't told correctly. And now all of a sudden we have this amazing technology that can be used for good to right some ethical wrongs of the past.
And to follow on that too, another thing we've talked about on utilizing AI, I want to bring that in here, is one of the more exciting applications was this idea of basically setting machine learning loose on data and seeing what connections it can make that you wouldn't make as a person. Because one of the challenges that people bring, no matter how much we try to be unbiased, we have natural biases, and we often do reject connections and conclusions that don't make sense to us out of hand. And one of the more exciting aspects was a company that was looking at doing connections between clinical trials and various drugs and trying to find unexpected benefits of existing drugs. And that wouldn't be possible if we didn't have extreme scalability, extreme performance, and API-driven application access. So you can set the machine learning loose on this. So I think sometimes people think storage is kind of a dry or an old school world, but frankly, the capabilities of these storage arrays are making exciting new things possible. And it doesn't have to be like a dystopia of searching for facial data and all the videos or anything. It can be a kind of an optimistic thing about finding unexpected medical connections and things like that.
I think that with the all the tools and all the software that we have today, including machine learning. So today we can think about data storage in a different way, especially the data we store in the storage. So once we have at least these 3 points: augmentation first, so to get everything out of the unstructured data that could be used; visibility, so that can help you. Once you have the augmentation, you can easily find your data sets, and then later you can have reusability, because if you can have all these 3 things together, you can start to reuse your data. So that's maybe the future. It's not for everybody today, but actually the more data you are storing, the more you see these kind of challenges, and the more you need to augment, get more visibility, and then you will be able to reuse the data. So that's it.
So returning to the premise of today's episode, you're not ready to deal with unstructured data. We obviously picked something that was a little controversial and fun to poke at. Enrico, do you think people are ready to deal with unstructured data, or do you think they're getting there?
Well, we're getting there. We solved a couple of huge problems: performance and scalability, and now we are trying to figure out how to reuse the data, or at least how to deal with this massive amount of data. As I said, data management is the key to do that, and with the right tools and with the right methodologies, it is possible to do more and manage the growth, and also manage the long term, the long tail of this data growth.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of time before everyone has access to some sort of methodology to keep all of their data and to use their big data. What I hope happens is that the people that are trying to do really good things with the data and to make things right in the world for everybody are ahead of the people that want to either hide data or use data in a way that would harm anybody. That's my hope.
Well, and I certainly agree with Enrico that we're getting to a place where there are offerings, there is the ability to deliver both the scale and the performance cost effectively. The things I would add to that would be, number one, that you need to think about doing that in a way where the infrastructure that underpins all of this is simple, that it is not adding, there's all this complexity we're talking about in all of the data and what you do with it. Let's let the data architects and your analytics team, basically be the place where all of the complexity needs to be sorted out. And I think that by really focusing on deploying a storage infrastructure that is not only performant and scalable, but also extremely simple as it scales, because this has been actually a big area of challenge. One of them maybe the third missing thing that we've seen, even as we've increased in scale and performance, is we've generally seen increasing complexity. And the corollary to that, which I meant to bring up earlier, but ties a little bit into some of our other conversations, and even from an ethical perspective, is can you do it with a reduced footprint? Can you do it in a way that reduces power, space, and cooling? And so those are the elements of, are you ready to deal with unstructured data, that I think should be relatively solvable in the grand scheme of all this other complexity we're talking about. But if they're not, it makes it that much harder to address the data that you're storing.
And from my perspective, as somebody who's watching the industry closely, the thing that I'm looking at right now is a lot of products that are truly integrated. So you have a system that isn't just, I'm going to take a storage system from here, and then I'm going to take, maybe an AI engine from here, but something that actually pulls it all together into a real converged stack. And I'm seeing those coming from a variety of different companies. And frankly, NVIDIA has been great in pushing those kind of partnerships, because that delivers not just a storage system that scales, but an entire AI-ready infrastructure that scales. And I think that to me is sort of the next generation of solutions to deal with the core question and to provide the kind of tools that companies need to be able to try to deal with this flood of unstructured data. So thank you so much for joining us for the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, and thank you everyone for listening. Before we go, let's take a moment to think about where we can connect and continue this conversation. Amy, let's start with you.
Please reach out to me on linkedin.com. I am pretty remedial on Twitter, so I'm a good follower, but I'm not good at posting, so thank you.
Enrico?
About me, it's simple. Just Google my name. It's easier than any Twitter handle or anything else. There are not many Enrico Signoretti that do storage in the world.
Twitter works the best for me. I'm Gminks, Gminks.
And you can find me at Foskett on most social media networks. So thank you, Gina and Enrico, for joining Amy and Pure Storage on this special sponsored episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do subscribe, rate, and review the show in iTunes, since that does help our visibility. And please share it with your friends. This podcast is brought to you by Pure Storage and also by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.